Charles ceded the rest of northern Italy to the Papal States with 2 treaties in 1537. Shortly after, the Papal States was renamed the Kingdom of God. My name is Quagersall, and I've been away from EU4 for quite some time. But I thought EU4 1.35 and the Domination DLC would be an amazing time to jump back in. I've not gotten a lot of time to play during my hiatus due to mental health issues, moving, and getting engaged. But now that I can play again, I couldn't resist jumping back into making videos as well. And what better campaign to reintroduce myself to the game than France, one of my favorite nations to play in this game. Now even better with their new mission tree. As soon as I realized I could play a crusading France that forms the Kingdom of God as my subject, I knew I wanted to play this campaign. I also decided to edit the campaign down to about a 30-minute video over which I would narrate a roleplay story, similar to the videos I was making just before my absence. I hope you guys enjoy, and let me know what you think in the comments down below the video, or other stuff you'd like to see, or just EU4 in general. I've missed a lot. If you guys want to see me continue this campaign, let me know by liking the video and watching it to the end. Maybe subscribe if you're feeling nice. Now I'll shut up and let's jump into the video. On Christmas Day in the year 800 AD, Charles I, also known as Charles the Great, or simply Charlemagne, was coronated by the Pope in Rome as the Emperor of the Romans, the first Holy Roman Emperor. Charlemagne's empire was a monster to behold, stretching from Francia to the Balkans and Italy to Denmark. All of Central Europe was held sway by the Frankish Empire. For nearly 6 centuries, the French half of Charlemagne's lands languished. By the early 1400s, the area directly under the control of the French crown was less than half of its de jure holdings. The Dukes of Brittany and Burgundy barely pay lip service to the crown, and the other dukes aren't much better. Worse still, the English have been waging war, the 100 Years' War, in an attempt to press their own claim to the French throne. It is amazing that this France is the same country that would rise to dominate not only Western Europe, but the world over the next 4 centuries, forging an empire vastly more powerful than the height of Charlemagne's own. This is the tale of the heirs of Charlemagne. Charles VII. King since the tender age of 19, Charles VII came to power upon the death of his father, Charles VI, who had disinherited his son in favor of the English king, Henry V. Luckily for Charles, the majority of the French dukes did not favor an English king, and even the Duke of Burgundy saw the wisdom of supporting Charles some 13 years later in the Treaty of Arras. For a time it looked promising for the French under Charles VII. Joan of Arc and her legendary valor inspired the nation to push back the English, but alas, she is no more, having been burned at the stake by the English. Now the English are refusing to cede the county of Maine, an area they had already agreed to relinquish via treaty, and the Duke of Burgundy again moves to antagonize the French crown with whispers of his intention to declare full independence. And so, in late 1444, our story begins. While some of his advisors cautioned for patience to allow the English time to surrender Maine, Charles decided to take to the offensive, securing an alliance and attacking the English, vowing to capture not only Maine, but proclaiming that every English foothold in France must be reclaimed. This final branch of the 100 Years' War would see French armies capturing all of Normandy and Gascony before moving south to support the Castilians against the Portuguese. The fighting in Iberia would eventually spill over into North Africa, where King Charles decided to include the capture of Ceuta in the armistice with Portugal. Thus began the renewed tradition of French kings leading crusades against the Muslims to defend the Catholic world. The eventual Treaty of Le Bord would see the French reclaiming Gascony, Normandy, and the Port of Calais, fully removing the English from the continent and further forcing the English to fully relinquish Henry V's claim to the French crown. All this cemented Charles VII as the true victor of the 100 Years' War. After the conclusion of the 100 Years' War, Charles shifted his focus back to the south, taking the mantle of the Reconquista alongside his own. His armies would conquer the entire remaining Emirate of Granada, and even assault the Moroccan fortress of Fez and Tangiers. In the peace with the Moroccans, the French would maintain a garrison on the fort of Tangiers and force the subjugation of the Emirate of Granada in 1449. The French occupation of Granada was fairly lenient beyond one condition. The Grenadians would be forced to convert to Catholicism or be put to the sword. Beyond this condition, the area was locally governed and enjoyed a large amount of autonomy from the greater French dominions for quite some time. The King of Aragon wasn't happy about French involvement in Iberia and North Africa, however, and in 1448 had entered into alliance with the Duchy of Brittany, supporting their nominal independence from the French crown and angering Charles. Subsequently, upon his return to France in 1450, after first securing a closer allegiance with the Duke of Burgundy, Charles declared war on Aragon, and through this on his rebellious Duke of Brittany. Initially, the King of Castile didn't want to get involved in this conflict, but later threw their lot in as the French armies were already marching. During the midst of the war, in July 1450, King Charles's son, Louis, the Dauphin and heir to the French throne, was thrown from a horse while preparing to lead an army to support the French push into Aragon. While the king maintained after investigation that the incident was merely an accident, the popular rumor was that the Duke of Provence was somehow at fault. So much so that the Pope would eventually excommunicate Duke René for this, and many other affronts to decency. This would become an interesting foreshadow of the complex relationship between the French crown and the papacy over the next several decades. Once victory had been obtained with Aragon, Charles let the Bretons off lightly, only demanding that they pay for the war and break any alliances with the English or Iberians. With Aragon, he demanded the fort of Roussillon and the transfer of the islands of Malta, which he intended to fashion into a base from which he could continue his crusade into North Africa. In the subsequent invasion of Tunis, Charles would instruct his commanders to capture the island fort of Djerba and to also leave a garrison in the city of Tunis itself, allowing the French to gain a foothold in this area of North Africa as well as largely control trade in the area later. After the death of his son and heir, and with him being too old to likely produce another, Charles had spent the 1450s trying to decide which ducal heir to pass the reins of the realm to after his death. He had indicated his favor to Jean de Foix, the 10-year-old next Duke of Foix, but with the birth of another Jean, Jean d'Armagnac, in 1454, his favor shifted to the Duke of Armagnac. So much so that the jealousy of the Duke of Bourbonnais and Auvergne would see them attack the Duchy of Armagnac and take some of his land. But this didn't stop Charles. In September 1456, he announced Jean d'Armagnac would be the next king of France, and shortly after he forced the resolution of the conflicts between the dukes. Once the succession was clear, in the late 1450s, Charles would send his armies to tie up a few loose ends, namely an invasion of northern Morocco to cut off the Moroccan access to the Mediterranean, and another invasion of Brittany to bring them fully into the fold. In exchange for possession of the lands of the Duchy of Brittany, and for the king's influence to lift the excommunication of the Duke of Provence, the man once called Good King René agreed to disinherit all of his heirs and allow the Duchy of Provence and all his titles to pass to the crown upon his death. Thus, an enlarged Provence would be a de facto personal union under the French crown. The last war of King Charles's reign was his second with the English. It was decided to prevent further English aggression on the continent that the French, with major support from the Duke of Burgundy and all of his vassals, would capture London with the intention of leaving a garrison behind to remind the English who the victors of any conflict between them would be. Thus, in July 1460, the attack on the English began. As in the previous conflict, the allies of the English were dealt with first. One by one, they accepted peace with the French. Friesland, in late 1460, gave up their main fort to a permanent Burgundian garrison, and later Portugal, in early 1462, and Savoy, in June of that same year, would be forced to fill French coffers in exchange for their support to the English. By late summer 1462, the English stood alone against the French and their allies. The first French troops made landfall in Cornwall in November 1462, and by March 1463 were sieging London. London fell to French armies in late October 1463. Unfortunately, Charles was unable to be there, having fallen ill and returning to France, He did hear of the fall of London and the very initial peace treaty negotiations, but quickly grew sicker and sicker. He died November 21st, 1463, falling 4 months short of his 61st birthday. Marie d'Anjou. While King Charles had determined that the young Jean d'Armagnac would succeed him, the young boy was only 9 years old upon the death of his benefactor, so the Queen Mother, along with a council of Dukes of the Blood, would reign in France until the boy's ascension. It was during the reign of Queen Regent Marie d'Anjou that the peace treaty with the English was eventually signed. In April 1464, the French took control of London and the Pale in Ireland. Additionally, the Duke of Burgundy stationed troops south of London and took de facto control of Sussex and Kent. This utter humiliation of the English would signal their decline as a major power from that point forward. As the next king was being instructed in the ways of leadership by his regent and the councils, the Duchy of Provence and its holdings in Lorraine, Bar, Brittany, Anjou, and Provence itself came directly under the control of the French crown, with the passing of Duke René in December 1465. Less than a year later, the death of another Duke of the Blood, this time the Duke of Burgundy, would see Burgundy, Flanders, Holland, and Brabant brought together under a direct personal union with France. Had just one or the other of these incidents occurred during the reign of the Queen Regent, it is likely that no one would have batted an eye. But to this day, either Marie or Jean is suspected to have been involved or even orchestrated these timely deaths to build upon the kingdom's power. The lands of Burgundy did not come easily into full control by the French crown, however, as in October 1467, a large revolt rose in Burgundy, demanding their independence from France. Later it was revealed that this revolt was likely financed by the Holy Roman Emperor himself, as he communicated an ultimatum to the French to relinquish the lowlands to the control of the Holy Roman Empire or come under attack. Queen Regent d'Anjou, along with the Council of Dukes, decided to deny the ultimatum and invited the emperor to, quote, send his armies to die at their earliest convenience. And so, on November 29th, the Holy Roman Empire, largely consisting of support from just Austria and Hungary, declared war. Marie was incensed that the Castilians refused to become involved in the conflict, but her dukes assured her that they would have no trouble fighting off the Austrians. Jean V d'Armagnac. In February 1469, Jean V d'Armagnac rose to take the mantle of the Kingdom of France, even as French armies had Vienna under siege. His first task was to order the armies of France to return after their capture of Vienna and the peace treaty that would see the Austrians pay for French losses in the war, to put down further pretender rebels in both Burgundy and France. Jean's early reign would see him continue French conquests in Africa before attacking Milan in July 1471 to press the French claim on the Milanese throne. The Milanese nobles would recognize Jean as their ruler in January 1474 and immediately call upon the French king to defend them from attack by Venice. Aragon supported the Venetians in this conflict, but it didn't last long, and in March 1475, the Venetians were forced to withdraw from Milan and renounce their claims to the area. Following these conflicts in northern Italy, in 1475, Jean declared that it was his intention to reassert Holy Roman influence in Italy, and if the emperor wouldn't do so or couldn't do so, then the heirs of Charlemagne in the west would have to. This was the first recorded use of Charlemagne's legacy by the French in this period, but it would not be the last. Jean was not without his faults, however. Perhaps overconfident from his victories, both symbolically and on the battlefield in Italy, he decided to launch his own invasion into England and Lower Scotland in January 1st, 1477. Perhaps due to his inept strategic decision to split the invasion force between London and an attack into Norfolk, and Ireland and an attack into Scotland, or because he decided to head the army striking out from London on his own, and in doing so proved his complete lack of ability to command. Whatever the case, the war proved disastrous, and by December, the French army had been routed in Sussex and was besieged outside London. Rather than see his army completely destroyed or captured, and perhaps fearing for his own life, Jean negotiated a quick peace. While a bit humiliating, having to reduce Burgundian possessions in Kent and pay the English, he proved his diplomatic prowess by avoiding relinquishing the French control of London and averting the English from crushing his own army equipped with cannons long before anyone else in Europe were using them in sieges. Following the disaster in London, Jean knew he needed some sort of victory to buoy the spirits of his nobles and avert the possibility of rebellion or forced abdication. So in early 1478, he began to authorize and even personally led attacks into Ireland. First Desmond and Kildare, then Tyrconnell, then Tyrone, Leinster, and Munster. By July 1480, only 2 independent Irish counties and a small English presence in Ulster remained outside the control of the French crown. Then in September, Jean authorized an attack on the 2 remaining independent barons, Sligo and Ormond. A year later, the last fortresses fell, and the vast majority of Ireland came under control of the French. Then, in December 1481, Jean concluded discussions with the Pope, in which he declared his intention, with the Pope's blessing, to reignite the fervor for the Crusades and conquer the Holy Land in the name of Christendom. Whether this was further to make up for his embarrassment in England, or from a true desire to push religious matters, is a matter of opinion among historians. But in any case, the Pope authorized holy wars against the Ottomans and Mamluks, and many among the Christian world began to flock to France in support of this cause. It took several years to prepare the French armies to attack towards the Holy Land, but in September 1483, the new crusade was called and the marching began. Back home, the semi-independent French dukes were having their lands integrated one by one into the crown of France, even as most of their troops were away supporting the crusade. The crusade to retake Jerusalem had several key moments, including the fall of Alexandria in November 1484, the major naval battles that would see the near destruction of the Mamlukian fleet, and the fall of Cairo in August 1485. Jerusalem itself was occupied by French forces in January 1486, but it didn't stop there, with Damascus falling in April. Just as the French armies approached the northernmost Mamluk fort of Halab, however, they found that the Ottomans had already laid it under siege. Not yet ready to face the Ottomans, they decided to consolidate their gains against the Mamluks first. The Mamluks were reluctant to sign a peace deal, threatening to remain in a perpetual state of war with the invading Christians. But finally in May 1487, with almost the entirety of the Levant and Egypt under occupation, the peace deal was signed, just outside of Cairo, and a swath of coast from the Nile to Syria, including Jerusalem, was ceded to the control of the French. In July, the Ottomans sent emissaries to Jean in the Holy Land, offering an alliance, framing themselves as a possible partner in the struggles against his rivals in the Holy Roman Empire. Jean didn't fall for it, however, and he made this secret alliance proposal public, informing the Pope and publicly denying the Ottoman advance. While the crusade against the Mamluks would be his crowning achievement, Jean would not live to see the shores of France again, dying on the way back home in August 1488, passing the reins of the French kingdom over to his son, Louis XI d'Armagnac. Louis XI had a wild youth. Known to be a sinner, he was involved in a scandal where he may or may not have slept with a lower courtier and a duke's wife, both on the same night of his ascension to the throne. But to his credit, he was 19 and seemingly drunk on his own power in the moment. The first few years of Louis's reign, he had to learn how to govern. Luckily, the responsibility sobered him quickly, and he set about consolidating his control on France proper. Working towards the conversion and integration of their burgeoning empire in Africa and the Middle East, and to convince the Holy Roman electors of his dignity, as he intended to fulfill his father's words and assert himself and his heirs as the successors of Charlemagne. In September 1491, he authorized a continuation of the crusade into Ottoman lands. While Louis did visit the Holy Land, he decided not to travel with the army north into Anatolia. Unlike his father, he felt no need to lead from the front and decided to appoint men better at fighting while he stayed back and ruled. This was something of a gamble, as some might see it as cowardly, but within 5 years the entire Ottoman Empire was occupied by French troops, and Louis's decision seemed a good one. The peace deal was erratic. Securing for France some portions of Syria, Louis declared his intention not only to restore Jerusalem, but also to reform the idea of the Outremer, or the larger collection of Crusader states that existed in the 1100s. Additionally, to weaken the Ottomans, he forced them to allow the independence of several small states throughout their empire. Whether this was effective in actually weakening them is hotly debated by historians. Following the fight against the Ottomans, Louis's celebrity saw many Holy Roman electors pledging their support for him as the next Holy Roman Emperor. And in September 1496, after the death of the former Emperor and Archduke of Austria, Louis XI of France was elected the new lawful sovereign of the Holy Roman Empire. One of Louis's first acts as Holy Roman Emperor was to officially induct France into the empire. This massive expansion of the realm gained him enough imperial authority to form the Reichsregiment. Following the focus on the Holy Land and then on Germany, Louis proved that he was still a French noble through and through when in January 1498 he declared war on the English, intent on paying them back for his father's humiliation in London. Once French armies had defeated the English and their Portuguese allies once again, Louis forced upon them a peace treaty that would restore the Burgundian possessions in Kent and kick England out of Ireland and the lower half of Scotland. In the north of Scotland, the Danish had taken large portions of land, and while the French were at war with Denmark, this area was not the focus of the war. They were waging war to remove Denmark from Holstein as part of Louis's Imperial ban proclamation that all non-HRE member states would be driven out of Holy Roman lands. Even as French armies marauded from England and Denmark, Emperor Louis was focusing on matters at home. Unable to conceive a child with his wife and rumored to be sterile, as despite his many dalliances as a young man he produced no bastard offspring, Louis decided to take as his heir the son of the Duke of Bourbonnais, the young Charles de Bourbon, to be his heir, officially announcing as such on December 30th, 1500. Following the restoration of Holstein to the empire, French nobles pressed the emperor to begin a new push into northern Italy, and in May 1502 he launched his attacks on Genoa, intent on connecting French and Milanese lands. The Genoese had a powerful string of allies and guarantors, from Aragon all the way to the Ottomans, but the French armies were able to best them all, and in just 4 years, in April 1506, the northern Italian coast from Nice to Genoa was incorporated into France proper, providing the land connection to Milan Louis's nobles desired, and opening up further expansion opportunities into Italy. Even as this conflict rages, the emperor's role as guardian of the empire continued, and an imperial intervention into Pomerania would see Stettin forced to return land to 3 other princely states in May 1507. This was the first of many interventions that the emperor and his heirs would prosecute as they tried to keep the empire split up, not allowing any one prince to gain unwieldy power. To this end, Louis secured from his nobles assent to tackle the largest obstacle to the Holy Roman unity under French command, the Austrians. And in June 1508, he launched an assault on the Austrians, declaring his intention to free the Electorate of Bohemia. The war would drag on for nearly 5 years, and the Austrians would resist, not only in Austria, Bohemia, and Hungary, but even in the lowlands. And in the end, the peace treaty would not specifically force the Austrians to give up their aegis over Bohemia, but would split the Austrians with the independence of Styria and reduce the power of Bohemia with the independence of 3 states from their lands. Shortly after his triumph over the Austrians, in June 1513, Louis XI, the man who would be the first French emperor of the Romans since Charlemagne, died of an infection at the ripe age of 44. His heir, Charles, was nearly old enough to come to power, but would be held in regency under his mother, Eleonora von Wetten, for about a year. Charles de Bourbon. Charles de Bourbon came to power at the age of 15 in February 1514. Technically reigning as Charles VIII in France, he was styled Charles II of the Holy Roman Empire. Charles's first mission was to finish the war with the Danish, restoring his vassal state of Scotland to the Highlands and removing Danish presence in the Isles. Later, he would fight in his first Holy Roman Intervention conflict, an attack into northern Italy, securing Montferrat and handing it over to a new vassal state in Saluzzo. Following this conflict, and likely due to a power play between Charles and the Pope, in which the Pope refused to coronate Charles without certain concessions, Charles declared that Italy should belong to His Holiness, and in exchange, the Papal States would relinquish some sovereignty to the Holy Roman Empire and the French Emperor. The resulting treaty would see all of northern Italy under the sway of the French, including Milan, Genoa, and the former Savoyard lands being transferred to the Pope. Charles proved his further dedication to the Church with his declaration of the Third French Crusade against the Mamluks in 1518. That would last 2 years and see the forts of Damascus and El Karak transferred to French control. Later, in 1523, as any good French ruler should do, Charles authorized another invasion of England. After this invasion, London itself was renamed to the Domaine Français. Then, an invasion of Tuscany and the full integration of Burgundy in July 1527 into the French crown. Many rulers outside of France were beginning to grow weary of watching the French grow so significantly in strength. In November 1528, Charles finally authorized the reformation of the Kingdom of Jerusalem, and after the unification of Spain in 1529, he decided to support a distant claimant to the crown of Aragon and attack the Spanish to reclaim the Aragonese lands. With a large chunk of the eastern coast of Iberia restored to his puppet Aragon in late 1532, Jerusalem was ceded the rest of the lands in the Levant following the war, and was officially incorporated as the Outremer in 1535, wiping away, at least in the eyes of the French and most of the Holy Roman Empire, the stain of the initial failed crusades. Following a series of wars in the 1530s, in which Venice and several small states like Mantua and Ferrara were annexed by the French and the Papal States, Charles ceded the rest of northern Italy to the Papal States with 2 treaties in 1537. Shortly after, the Papal States was renamed the Kingdom of God, as the Pope was hailed as the great unifier, having led the Christian world to restore the Holy Land. But everyone knew who the real power had come from, and soon Charles would exact his price for his and his ancestors' immense labor. Now it was time to move on to Naples, as Charles had thrown down the gauntlet and determined to have Italy unified at all costs. The Pope himself had desired to be able to hold sway in Naples, and for a time even sided in defense of them. But a quick trouncing by French armies relieved him of this delusion, and in the process Avignon was ceded to France, before the French-Papal alliance was restored shortly after the war. The first peace with Naples would commence in September 1539, and Charles would be forced to wait out a period of truce, contenting himself with focusing on the empire proper, looking to split up princes, while all the while watching Austria reassert itself in the east and incorporate Hungary and Bohemia fully into itself, even reigning in the Balkans as far as Constantinople. Unfortunately for Charles, he would die in 1542, at the age of only 43. Despite the similarly short life of several of his ancestors, many still suspect foul play in this occurrence, especially as the regency for Charles's young son Louis was famously ineffective, and this opened up a period of inactivity in which a coalition could form to stop the French from growing further in strength. Louis XII de Bourbon. While only 5 years old at the time of the death of his father, Louis XII de Bourbon was declared King of France and Emperor of the Romans almost immediately. His mother, Anne Bonaparte, was slated to be his queen regent, but her inability, or possibly lack of desire for this role, passed the responsibility largely to one Ermengarde Bonaparte, a distant relation of his mother, who was mainly a mediocre military man and thus unfit to run the state. What followed was a period of inaction over the course of the next decade that would see the enemies of France from England to the Holy Land and from Iberia to Scandinavia, and especially in the Holy Roman Empire proper, gather their strength and begin preparations for a major coalition against the French. Louis XII de Bourbon finally came of age in October 1522. His first major action, besides pledging continued support to the Polish in their conflict in Prussia, was to attack Naples, looking to fully annex them as a French possession. This backfired, however, as the country proved too large to justify to fully capture. So in 1554, just after signing the second peace treaty between France and Naples, Louis immediately authorized the breaking of this treaty and further attacks on Naples to solidify French control in the peninsula. The breaking of his and his nation's sacred honor in breaking a truce threw the French Empire in disarray. The lowlands immediately began to revolt, and the Holy Roman princes led by Austria began to publicly denounce the French and incite their intentions toward a coalition war. Louis decided to double down and demanded the papacy honor their previous treaty obligations and submit as a subject of the Holy Roman Empire and France proper. He reformed a new kingdom of Naples as a vassal state of France and began to build troops and prepare financially and structurally for the largest conflict ever known to man. The War of the First Coalition. Louis's plans for the war were fairly simple. He would declare war on the Spanish to incite the conflict, focusing the bulk of his forces against them initially to occupy Iberia. At the same time, secondary forces would defend France proper from attacks from the Empire, and a small army would be dispatched to the British Isles to mop up the English. Additionally, Louis declared the neutrality of both the Outremer and Algiers, in the hopes to keep fighting out of Africa and the Middle East. This would prove a wise decision, as both the Mamluks and the Ottomans would become involved in the conflict in due time. While paling in comparison to some of the later coalition wars against the French, the War of the First Coalition was still massive, with the French and her allies fielding troops in excess of 420,000, and her enemies bringing nearly 700,000 of their own at the declaration of hostilities in July 1555. Within a year's time, both Iberia and England were largely occupied, and Holy Roman attacks into the Low Countries had been rebuffed, with the positive side effect of several Dutch revolts being caught in the crossfires of the war and destroyed, with Den Haag and later Frise reclaimed in the late summer, and attacks into Burgundy proper pushed back into the empire by the autumn. One of the main reasons for the scale of French victories early was the Holy Roman Empire's focus on Poland. Especially the Austrians had focused their entire armies in Poland and Lithuania, and had occupied the vast majority of their lands by the time the French armies entered Poland in early 1577. They were able to recapture Poznan in February and march to relieve Warsaw. But it was a case of too little, too late. The Polish, watching the French army lose to nearly 170,000 strong coalition force outside Warsaw, knew the writing was on the wall, and in April they signed an armistice with the Austrians and the coalition, ceding Austria the border fort of Nowy Sącz, along with the other coalition concessions. Now the entire coalition could focus on France alone. But all was not lost. The French army had struck out across the empire in both a northern and southern prong. The north had failed to retake Warsaw, but the south had succeeded in its capture of Vienna. Here, after capturing the Austrian capital, the French armies would drive back numerous coalition attempts to recapture the city. Later, they pushed north to capture Prague and several other key Bohemian cities. The public impression of the war was that the French were invincible, and that the coalition could do little more but to pick at French allies. Louis knew better, however. He knew the coalition outmassed him by nearly twice the manpower, and after the disastrous defeat at the Fourth Battle of Vienna, he authorized a negotiation of a peace deal before the tide of the war could shift out of their favor. And so, on February 5th, 1559, after another sweep of Vienna and Prague to discourage the enemy, the coalition agreed to a peace deal that would fully restore the crown of Aragon. And so the War of the First Coalition was at an end. But neither the French under Louis or their enemies harbored any illusions that it would be the last. In Iberia, the Aragonese king declared his intention to unite the entirety of Iberia under his, and therefore, French control. In the British Isles, England still stands, and Louis himself has sworn to see their destruction. And in the Empire, the Austrians and the Reformation both stand as enormous obstacles to French dominance. Elsewhere, the Pope is a rebellious subject, and the Ottomans and Mamluks would love to pounce on reclaiming the Holy Land at the first sign of French weakness. The path forward for France is one wrought with danger, but if these and whatever other storms can be weathered, she is in an excellent position to dominate not only Europe, but the globe moving forward. That will have to be a story for another time. Let me know if you want to see more of this campaign in the comments below. Thanks for watching. They attacked me. The bastards. We'll try again. Let's see if they'll do it this time. Son of a bee. Third time's a charm? Maybe this time? Damn it. Come on. Do it for me? Come on, you know you want to. Please. This is it. This is gonna be the one. I know it. Damn it. I'm gonna kill Brittany, then try to get it. I guess it's time. Let's give it a shot. They did it! First try! Holy shit. Hey, you made it to the end of the video. How about checking out one of the other videos on the screen? Leave a like if you enjoyed, and subscribe if you want to see more. It really helps out the channel. Comment down below with other videos you'd like to see, or head on over to the Discord. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next video.